Hey y'all, it's Two Brains, Three Eyes, and I'm back with another video. And today we're going to get into why having uncomfortable conversations is important in relationships. So, you got this Karmelo Anthony case, right? And, this is the kind of case that can make interracial relationships very uncomfortable in a way. And not because, the love suddenly disappears, but because cases like this force people to confront race, culture, and a little bit of history. All right. And a lot of couples realize they never actually had those conversations. You can love somebody deeply and still be completely disconnected when it comes to race. That's possible. And that's the uncomfortable truth right there. A lot of interracial couples focus on, the fun stuff, the chemistry. We love each other. Love has no color. The attraction, the lifestyle, the cute mixed babies, everybody romanticizes. The food, the holidays, the differences that feel exciting in the beginning. But what happens when something racial happens in the news? So what happens when a black person says, this feels racially charged, and their partner says, I think you're making this about race? Like, how do you go about that? And now you've got tension, because this isn't just about a news story anymore. It becomes about whether your partner actually sees your reality. And the Karmelo Anthony case can trigger, deep conversations about justice, privilege, perception, and also fear. And if you can't talk about those things in your relationship, that's a red flag, a major red flag. Because if race is uncomfortable to discuss while dating, what happens when you have children? And that's going to be where it gets deeper, because a lot of people love the idea of interracial children. But let's be honest, in America, if one parent is black, society often sees that child as black first. Pay attention. That means your child may experience racial profiling. Your child may be stereotyped. Your son may be viewed as older, more threatening, or less innocent. Your daughter may deal with identity confusion, colorism, or hair discrimination. Now imagine raising that child with a partner who refuses to discuss race. How do you protect your kids? How do you prepare them? How do you explain to them why the world may treat them differently? You can't raise a black identifying child while pretending race doesn't matter. That just doesn't work. And this is where uncomfortable conversations become necessary. And here we got some red flags. Red flag number one, your partner shuts down whenever race comes up. Whew. You mention something racial, and, they automatically get defensive. They say things like, I'm tired of everything being about race. Why does it always have to come back to that? You overthinking it. That's a problem. Because dismissal creates emotional distance. Okay? You got another red flag. What if they prioritize comfort over truth? Some people would rather avoid discomfort than confront reality. But growth requires discomfort. When you work out, it's painful. No pain, no gain. Or when you start that first job, the first day is, top 10 worst experience anybody could ever have. The first day at the job, you feel stupid, but, you're getting uncomfortable. You have to ask questions and you feel like you're bothering someone, but you have to go through that uncomfortable phase just to get to where you need to be, right? If your partner is more concerned with staying comfortable than understanding your perspective, that's dangerous long term, especially in an interracial relationship. You got another red flag. They've never examined their own bias. Everybody has bias. Black people, white people, everybody. The question isn't whether bias exists. The question is whether someone has the maturity to examine it. Can they say, maybe I have blind spots? Maybe can they say, maybe there are things I don't understand? That kind of humility matters, right? We got another red flag. You feel like you have to shrink yourself to keep the peace. And that's the biggest one, me personally. If every time you bring up racial concerns, it turns into an argument, eventually you just stop talking and you silence yourself. You start filtering your thoughts. That is not emotional safety, okay? That's survival. And here's a question I think people need to ask themselves. Why didn't y'all talk about this sooner? Like, seriously, why? Sometimes it's because, attraction moved faster than emotional depth. Sometimes people assume love would solve everything. But love doesn't automatically create understanding. Communication does. Awareness does. Intentional conversations do. And some couples avoid, these conversations because they're scared of what they'll discover. Because what if you realize your partner sees the world completely different? What if their family carries prejudice? What if they minimize your lived experience? That is scary. But it's better to know now than after marriage. Better now than after kids. Because once children enter the picture, your differences don't stay theoretical. They become parenting decisions. Do you teach your kids about racism early? How do you talk about police encounters? How do you teach them about code switching? What about hair, culture, identity, history? Whose perspective dominates in the household? These questions matter. And here's another truth people don't like. Interracial relationships don't erase racism. Let me say that again. Interracial relationships don't erase racism. On Dr. Umar, they don't. Sometimes people think dating outside their race means they've transcended racial issues. No. People in interracial relationships can actually expose racial issues more intensely. Just like you got the slave master, just because he was having sex with his slaves doesn't mean he loved them. Or maybe because slave master gave you an extra piece of pie, he loves you as a person. Because now race lives in your home, at your dinner table, in your parenting, in your family gatherings, and how your in-laws treat you. And what comments get made around your children too. And then those conversations, if those conversations never happen, resentment is going to grow. And that's why cases like Karmelo matter beyond the headlines. They're going to reveal fault lines. They're going to expose what people really believe about innocence, guilt, danger, and who gets the benefit of the doubt. And that affects relationships because your partner's reaction may reveal things you never noticed before. You might hear them talk about the case and think, wait, is that how you see black people? Is that what you think about young black men? Would you subconsciously see our son that way? That's a painful thought, but it's real. And I want to say this too. Having difficult conversations doesn't mean the relationship is doomed. Actually, healthy couples can disagree. The issue isn't disagreement. The issue is whether both people can stay open. Can both people listen? Can both people tolerate discomfort? Can both people say, help me understand? That phrase alone can change everything. Help me understand. Not debate me, not defeat me. Just understand me. That's the goal. Understanding. Because if your partner can't sit in uncomfortable truth with you, how will they handle raising children with layered identities? Because kids notice everything. They notice tension. They notice silence. They notice what gets talked about and what gets avoided. So if race is taboo between the parents, children feel that too. And silence teaches lessons. Sometimes silence teaches shame. That's why I believe uncomfortable conversations are necessary. Not optional, necessary. Especially in interracial relationships. Because you're not blending personalities, you're blending histories, you're blending cultures, you're blending inherited pain, narratives, fears, and experiences. And that's going to require some level of maturity. So if you're in an interracial relationship, ask yourself, can we talk about race honestly? Can we talk about injustice without defensiveness? Can we talk about how our future kids may be perceived? Can we talk about cultural differences without ego? And if the answer is no, that's something to pay attention to. Because avoiding uncomfortable conversations doesn't make the issue disappear. It just delays the collision. And eventually life will force the conversation. The news will force it. School will force it. Your children will force it. Society will force it. So you might as well talk now, because silence is not peace. Sometimes silence is just unresolved tension wearing a smile. And relationships built on avoidance become fragile. Strong relationships can handle truth, even uncomfortable truth, especially uncomfortable truth. So if you are in an interracial relationship, I want to know, what have your experiences been like in the household talking about the Karmelo case, at least. Drop your comments in the section below, and I'll see you on the next video.